Picture this. It's 1917. You are Alexander Kerensky, Prime Minister of Russia, and your country's in a bit of a pickle. In March, or February old style, a series of demonstrations against food rationing in Petrograd rapidly turned into a revolution as the city's garrison sided with the demonstrators, culminating in the Tsar's abdication. What followed was nothing short of total anarchy. The bourgeois provisional government that emerged proved incompetent and unpopular, and is forced to share power with the Petrograd Soviet, a socialist city council which opposes the liberal bourgeois provisional government and competes with it for influence, as well as providing a perfect ladder for Lenin and the radical Bolsheviks to build up power to lead a second communist revolution. Following a disastrous offensive on the Eastern Front, armed demonstrations against the government by the left, and more precisely the cadets leaving the government in protest over the government's inadequacies, the then PM of Russia, Prince Georgy Lvov, resigned, and now you, Alexander Kerensky, are in charge. Things are not looking good. The armed demonstrations were dispersed and its leaders persecuted, temporarily extinguishing the threats of revolution, but not for long. Furthermore, clashes with the commander-in-chief of the Russian army, Kornilov, over how to restore order in the country, have strained the relationship between the government and the military to a near breaking point. Suddenly, a fellow named Vladimir Lvov, not to be confused with Prince Lvov, the previous prime minister, comes up and tells you that your generals are plotting to kill you, so you send him to find out more. He returns a couple days later, claiming to have spoken with Kornilov, who he claims to be on supreme power to stop the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolsheviks from seizing power. This is the situation that Kerensky found himself in late August 1917. Both sides of the political spectrum are closing in on you, and you must choose one to decide with to defeat the other. But as you'll soon find out, this squeeze is more one-sided than it seems. First, to set the scene, I'll briefly go over the February Revolution and its aftermath. So, Russia was in the middle of World War I, and they weren't doing too hot. In 1914, their attack into East Prussia got utterly obliterated by a much smaller German force in one of the most thorough ass beatings in history. The attack in Galicia went better, but in 1915, the Goliath-Tatarov offensive broke the front hard enough to beat them back to a line stretching from Riga to Bukovina. In 1916, the Brusilov offensive was pretty successful, and it expended a lot of Russian manpower and equipment, and morale quickly started dropping as the offensive ended. By the start of the next year, 1917, the Russian troops were now incredibly demoralized, and the home front continued to struggle, with disillusionment with the government increasing by the day. In March 1917, which, by the way, I'm going to be using the new style dates from now on, workers at the Putilov factory went on strike, and a few days later was joined by people celebrating International Women's Day and protesting food rationing, which was then followed by more strikes and demonstrations against the government, food rationing, and the war in general. Within a few days, some 250,000 strikers were in the streets. Eventually, the Petrograd garrison itself was mutinying, and the situation was out of control. The Tsar abdicated on 15th of March in favor of his brother, who himself refused the throne. 300 years of Romanov rule was ended in a week. With the Tsar gone, the State Duma, the parliament of the Russian Empire, proclaimed a provisional government, but at the same time the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, or Petrograd Soviet for short, established itself as another contender for power, even before the provisional government was created. In effect, the provisional government represented the bourgeoisie, while the Soviet represented the proletariat. That said, left-wing socialist parties like the Socialist Revolutionaries, or SRs, were present in the provisional government, although these groups supported reform instead of revolution. Subsequent dual power meant that there was no real authority in the country, that was unanimously recognized at least, leading to a general lack of order in the country. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, who had only recently arrived in Russia after being sent there by the Germans, were gradually building a power base largely within the Petrograd Soviet, with the ultimate goal of coupping the provisional government and establishing a socialist state. This led to the July Days, a period of unrest where armed demonstrations against the government, egged on by the Bolsheviks, sprung up, but were eventually put down, and the Bolsheviks were suppressed for the time being. This crisis followed after two other crises, one being the utter failure of the Kerensky offensive, which was largely sabotaged by a lack of discipline in the army following a misinterpretation of a Soviet order that was mistaken to mean the troops could elect their own officers, and the sudden departure of Prime Minister Georgy Lvov, largely spurred on by Constitutional Democratic Party or cadet ministers leaving the government in protest of its ineffectiveness. For now, the provisional government survived these sudden crises, but its reputation was practically beyond saving, and agitation from both sides of the political spectrum were growing louder by the day. It was amidst these incidents that one Alexander Kerensky, an SAR and Minister of War, arose as Prime Minister of Russia. So, this Kerensky guy was a pretty good orator, and that's about where his good qualities end. He viewed himself as above the conflict between the left and the right, probably because he was the only minister that is serving both the provisional government and the Ispolkom, the executive committee of the Petrograd Soviet. But in viewing himself as above this conflict, he became ignorant of both sides, and the Bolsheviks began gradually pulling other leftists to their cause as fear of a counter-revolution grew. Meanwhile, as the front began collapsing in the wake of Central Power's counterattacks, the right began looking for a strongman to fix the situation, a search which coalesced around one Lavr Kornilov, a very skilled general who had led the only really successful attack of the Kerensky offensive. Kornilov had recently been appointed commander-in-chief and for his part did seek to restore order in the military and country, but to what extent is unclear. Kerensky, who still thought himself in control of the situation, grew increasingly suspicious of Kornilov and other officers. In August, Kerensky called a state conference in Moscow in the hopes of gathering support for his government. He sought to solidify his own image of himself as a link between the left and the right, but by now, the crevice in the government had become a ravine. Kornilov himself arrived on the day of the conference, where he was greeted with the grand procession, showered with flowers, and carried on the soldiers of officers out of the train station. He did not attend the conference that day, but when he entered on the second day, the riot met him with a standing ovation, while the left was much more muted. Meanwhile, Kerensky's closing speech that day was about as representative of the situation as it could get. Antony Beevor writes in his book, Russia, Revolution and Civil War, 1917-1921, that, quote, Kerensky's closing speech seemed interminable, meandering, and increasingly incoherent. Beevor also writes at this conference that, quote, the right, joyful at the prospect of turning back the clock, was as blind as the moderate left to the danger that this political polarization could only benefit the Bolsheviks. This was reflected in the Petrograd Soviet's elections on 20th of August, when the Bolsheviks took a third of the votes, a 50% increase from the 3 months prior. Kornilov, with the help of one Boris Savinkov as editor, submitted plans to restore order in the military. He believed that Kerensky agreed to all points, but after multiple delays trying to get a signature, Kornilov discovered that Kerensky was in fact opposed to the death penalty being restored to rear troops. Kerensky was now terrified of Kornilov's increasingly authoritarian demands, believing that it would disrupt his balancing act, which in effect was already breaking rapidly. Further pushing Kerensky into paranoia, he was told of an officer's plot to overthrow him by the chief commissar Filanenko at the Stavka. Once again, a former Duma deputy named Vladimir Lvov, of no relation to Georgy Lvov mentioned earlier, came to Kerensky with the same story of an officer's plot, but adding that they wanted to kill him. How Kerensky replied is not exactly known, but he likely did not tell Lvov to go and negotiate with Kornilov to convince him to try and seize power, which is exactly what Mr. Lvov did. Lvov traveled to Mogilev to see Kornilov and introduced himself as a representative for Kerensky, which he was not. Lvov then implied that Kerensky had proposed Kornilov assume dictatorial powers, or help Kerensky assume such powers, which Kerensky did not do. Kornilov agreed to a dictatorship under himself, but added he would be fine working under Kerensky, and said that Kerensky should visit Mogilev to discuss terms. Lvov then went back to Petrograd, where he told Kerensky that Kornilov demanded supreme power, which he did not demand, sending Kerensky into a panic. He knew, or thought he knew, that his biggest threat now came from the right, that therefore he should collaborate with the radical left to stop Kornilov. What was going on in the mind of Mr. Lvov, a conservative Octoberist, to spin this story is way beyond me. With Kerensky now about as paranoid as Stalin would be a few years later, he summoned an emergency meeting of the Council of Ministers, denounced Kornilov as a traitor, and demanded dictatorial powers. Savinkov immediately knew there was a misunderstanding, and asked Kerensky to directly speak with Kornilov, which Kerensky responded to by wallowing in his own despair, claiming that it was too late, which it was not. Kornilov, still under the understanding that he was to work with Kerensky to create a dictatorship, sent a telegram confirming that he would concentrate the 3rd Cavalry Corps south of Petrograd and requested martial law in the city. Kerensky responded by dismissing Kornilov from his position as commander-in-chief. By now, Kornilov was under the impression that a Bolshevik coup had already taken place, but upon finding out that Kerensky was, in fact, still in power and accused him of treason, began to believe that he had been tricked into this. Kornilov, later that day, proclaimed the Russian people as innocents and accused the provisional government of being coerced by the Soviets into following the plan of the German General Staff, which, by the way, there was a whole other conspiracy that the Germans had engineered the collapse of the Tsarist regime and were puppeting the Petrograd Soviet to cause instability, which is not exactly true, although they did send one into Russia. Now, both sides were scrambling to gather support from themselves. Many officers were hesitant to support Kornilov, unsure of what was going on, though others, such as one Karl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, were in support. General Mikhail Alexeyev was appointed commander-in-chief by Kerensky, which he accepted, but he remained uneasy over Kerensky's behavior during the ordeal. Kerensky did also achieve his goal of rallying the left on his side, and for their part, the left did seem to genuinely support Kerensky, for now. The Red Guards, disbanded after the July days, were reformed and rearmed for the defense of Petrograd. The Bolsheviks were given all they needed on a silver platter, and Kerensky was none the wiser. Railway workers began to dismantle and block the railways to Petrograd to halt Kornilov. This had been done to halt the Tsar months prior. Within a couple of days, Kornilov and his allies had been arrested. The whole series of events culminated in a big old nothing burger, or so it seemed. The fallout of the Kornilov affair was immense. Most of the generals involved in the supposed coup, including Kornilov himself, were imprisoned. General Krymov surrendered himself and soon shot himself in the heart. A few, such as Peter Wrangel, were sacked in their positions, with Wrangel himself leaving for Crimea, where he stayed until the Civil War began. General Alexeyev, now disillusioned with Kerensky, resigned from his position as commander-in-chief. Possibly most consequential of all, the left had been given everything they needed to stop a non-existent right-wing coup, and now, with the Bolsheviks revitalized and rapidly infiltrating the Soviet, soon Kerensky's guns would be turned against him from behind. Thank you all for watching this video. It's a bit short, I have a much longer video about Wang Jingwei in the earlier planning stage, and with how large the scope is, it's going to take a while to make, so figured I may as well work on some smaller stuff in between. This particular topic was spurred on largely from the section about Vladimir Lvov, since I had never heard about it before and it's just so bizarrely comical. I read about it in Antony Beevor's aforementioned book, which is the main source I used. Very good book, by the way. I highly recommend if you're interested in the Russian Revolution and Civil War. Like I said, there may be a few shorter, less research-intensive videos while I work on the Managing Way video. Hope you guys enjoyed, and see you soon, hopefully.